Oh, I knew exactly what my wife was doing every Thursday night. I knew the name of the man she was doing it with. I knew the hotel, the floor, even the room number. I had known for 11 weeks, and I hadn't said a single word. That's the part people never understand when I tell this story. They always ask, why didn't you just confront her? And the honest answer is that confronting her would have been the stupidest thing I could have done. I'm a CPA. I've spent 23 years of my life finding the mistakes other people made when they acted too fast. I wasn't going to make that same mistake myself. My name is Daniel. I'm 51 years old, and until about 2 years ago, I believed I had a good life. I had built a small but respected accounting firm in Raleigh, North Carolina. My wife, of 19 years, was a hospital administrator named Sandra. We had a house in a good neighborhood, 2 dogs, and what I thought was a solid, if quiet, marriage. We weren't the couple that held hands at the movies anymore, but I figured that was just what happened after 2 decades. You settle into something comfortable. I was fine with comfortable. The first sign came on a Tuesday in October. I had come home early with a migraine and found a text notification lit up on the counter where Sandra had left her phone to charge. I wasn't trying to read it. I wasn't suspicious. I just happened to glance down at the wrong moment. The name on the screen was Marcus. The preview of the message read, "Last night was everything. You're incredible." I stood there for probably 30 seconds. Sandra was upstairs in the shower. I could hear the pipes. I set my briefcase down, went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and sat at the table in the dark for a long time. I didn't pick up her phone. I didn't go upstairs. When she came down and found me sitting there, I told her the migraine had gotten worse and I was going to bed early. She said okay and asked if I wanted ibuprofen. I said no thank you. I lay in bed that night and stared at the ceiling and made myself think like an accountant instead of a husband. An accountant doesn't panic at a single irregularity. An accountant documents. An accountant builds a complete picture before drawing any conclusions. So I started building. Over the next 3 weeks, I noticed a pattern. Thursday evenings, Sandra would say she was covering for a colleague, some scheduling conflict at the hospital that required her presence until 9 or 10 at night. She had used that same excuse 6 times in 6 weeks before I started paying attention. I began checking small things. The mileage on her car didn't match a round trip to the hospital. Her hospital badge logs, which I was able to see because I had helped set up the payroll software for their administrative department 2 years earlier, and still had login credentials she didn't know I remembered, showed she had clocked out at her regular time every single Thursday. She wasn't staying late at work. She was somewhere else entirely. I hired a private investigator named Roy. I found him through a colleague who had used him during a messy business dispute. Roy was in his 60s, wore the same beige jacket every time I met him, and had the energy of a man who had stopped being surprised by anything a long time ago. I gave him the Thursday timeline. He asked me 3 questions, told me his rate, and shook my hand. 2 Thursdays later, he handed me a manila folder in a Panera Bread parking lot. Inside were photographs, timestamps, and a hotel receipt photographed through the windshield of Marcus's car. The hotel was a Marriott Courtyard 20 minutes from our house. Marcus was Marcus Hale, the newly appointed Chief Operations Officer of the hospital system where Sandra worked. He was 44, recently divorced, and had transferred from the Atlanta office 8 months ago. 8 months. This had been going on since almost the day he arrived. I sat in my car in that parking lot for a while. Roy sat in his own car nearby, giving me space, which I appreciated. What I felt was not what I expected to feel. I expected rage. What I actually felt was something colder and quieter. The word that came to mind, strange as it sounds, was clarity. Everything I had been half-sensing and dismissing for months suddenly had a shape, a name, a room number, and that clarity didn't make me want to throw things. It made me want to plan. I called my attorney the next morning. His name was Phil, and he had been my personal attorney for 9 years. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had always appreciated about Phil. When I finished, he asked me a few questions about our financial structure. We had joint accounts, a joint mortgage, and a partnership interest I held in a commercial property with 2 other investors. Sandra's name was not on the property investment, but she could make a claim against the marital estate for its appreciation over time. Phil told me the first thing I needed to do was nothing visible. The second thing I needed to do was document everything. I was already halfway there. Over the following 6 weeks, while Sandra kissed me goodbye every morning and told me about her days at dinner, I was quietly reorganizing our finances in ways that were completely legal and completely strategic. I moved my personal investment accounts, which had always been in my name alone, to a new brokerage. I documented every joint asset. I had Phil begin drafting. I gathered 19 years of tax returns. I made copies of everything that lived in our shared filing cabinet in the home office and stored them at my own office downtown. I also did one other thing. The firm I had built over 23 years had a junior partner named Kevin, who had been with me for 8 years and was ready, in my honest assessment, to buy me out. We had talked about it loosely a couple of years back, but I had never been serious about it. Now I was. Kevin and I had 3 confidential conversations over the course of a month. We agreed on a number. Phil drew up the paperwork. I structured the buyout so that the payments would come to me personally over 5 years, starting after the divorce was finalized. On paper, my income dropped considerably. Sandra had no idea any of this was happening. The Thursday that Phil told me the paperwork was ready, I came home at my normal time, ate the pasta Sandra had made, asked about her day, told her mine had been fine, and watched 2 episodes of a documentary with her on the couch. She fell asleep against my shoulder around 9:30. I sat there for a few minutes after her breathing slowed. I thought about 19 years. I thought about who I had been at 32 when we got married. I thought about a lot of things. Then I moved her gently to the cushion, covered her with a blanket from the armchair, turned off the television, and went to bed. The next morning I was up before her. I made coffee. When she came downstairs, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup for her already poured, the way I had done for years. She sat across from me and said, "Good morning." I said, "Good morning." Then I slid the envelope across the table. She looked at it, then at me. "What is this?" "Open it," I said. She did. I watched her read the first page. I watched the color change in her face. It wasn't dramatic. It was actually very quiet. Her hands went still. "Daniel, I'm not angry," I said, which was mostly true by that point. "I'm not gangry," I said, which was mostly true by that point. "I'm not going to make a scene. The paperwork is already filed. Phil has been in contact with your attorney, Cheryl. And yes, I know who you've been using because you called her from our home phone in September, which I assume was a consult about your own options. That's fine. It's all very tidy." She stared at me. "The photographs are in there too," I said. "Roy did good work." Sandra tried several things over the next few minutes. She tried tears, which were real, I think. She tried an explanation, which started with the word lonely, and I let her get about 3 sentences in before I held up my hand. Not unkindly. "I just didn't need it. I'm going to stay at my brother's for the next few weeks while we work through the process," I said. "The dogs stay here. I'll come get them when I have a permanent place. I'd appreciate it if you told your attorney to keep this clean. I have no interest in making either of our lives worse than necessary." I picked up my coffee, finished it standing at the counter, rinsed the mug, and put it in the drying rack. Then I drove to my office. I want to be honest about something. The weeks that followed were not triumphant. Staying at my brother Greg's house was humbling in a way I hadn't prepared for. Greg and his wife Karen were kind and discreet and didn't ask more questions than necessary, but sleeping on their guest room mattress and eating breakfast at their kitchen table at 51 years old had a particular texture to it that I hadn't anticipated. Some nights I lay awake and the cold clarity I had felt in that parking lot was completely gone, and what replaced it was something much more ordinary and much harder. Grief, probably. For the years. For the version of my life I had believed in. I exercised every morning because I needed something physical to anchor the days. I ran 3 miles, then 4, then 5. I had been soft around the middle for years, and I stopped being soft. It gave me something to do with my hands and my lungs and the part of my brain that didn't want to think. Sandra, meanwhile, had apparently moved Marcus into the house within 2 weeks of my leaving. My neighbor Ellen texted me about it because she and Sandra had never been particularly close, and she seemed to feel I deserved to know. I thanked her. I didn't text back again. Marcus Hale, it turned out, had a prior divorce of his own, and that divorce had included some financial arrangements with his ex-wife in Atlanta that his attorneys had been less than fully transparent about. Phil discovered this during the discovery process because Marcus's finances were now theoretically relevant to Sandra's ability to meet her share of certain joint obligations. What Phil found was interesting. Marcus had represented himself to his employer and apparently to Sandra as considerably more financially stable than he actually was. The Atlanta divorce had left him in a precarious position. He was spending on a COO's image using a COO's salary with very little cushion underneath. I didn't do anything with this information immediately. I just let Phil note it and file it. The divorce itself took 7 months. Sandra's attorney was aggressive in the early stages, making claims about the firm's valuation that required 3 rounds of financial documentation to disprove. Phil was patient and methodical, and occasionally, I think, took genuine pleasure in the process. The firm valuation was based on my now reduced income, the partner buyout structure, and 5 years of documented revenue trends. Sandra ended up with the house which she wanted, a settlement figure that was fair but not generous, and her own retirement accounts. I kept my investment accounts, the commercial property interest, and the structured buyout payments from Kevin, which would arrive quietly and consistently for the next 5 years. It was not a perfect outcome for either of us, but it was an honest one. The part of this story that people find most satisfying when I tell it is not actually the divorce. It's what happened about 4 months after it was finalized. Marcus had been living in what was now Sandra's house. They had, by all accounts, from Ellen and from Greg's wife Karen, who had mutual friends with Sandra, been presenting themselves around town as a couple with considerable confidence. Marcus had a taste for visible spending. New car in the driveway. Renovations started on the house. A vacation to Portugal that Sandra had mentioned to mutual acquaintances. What Marcus apparently had not told Sandra was that he was carrying significant credit card debt from the Atlanta years that had never been fully resolved, and that his position at the hospital was, quietly, under review. Hospital systems do their own financial audits of senior executives from time to time. Marcus had approved several vendor contracts in Atlanta that were now attracting retroactive scrutiny. The hospital's board retained an outside audit firm to review his tenure in the Atlanta office. I did not know this was happening. I want to be clear about that. I had not reported anything to anyone. I had not contacted the hospital board. I had not made any calls. Phil had found the financial information during discovery, and that information had been filed as part of the legal proceedings, which are, by nature, public record. What anyone else did with public records was not my doing. Marcus resigned from the hospital in February. The official statement was that he was pursuing other opportunities. Sandra, from what Karen heard through their mutual network, had not been told this was coming. The renovation on the house stopped halfway through. I heard all of this secondhand through the quiet channels that small social networks provide. I didn't take any particular pleasure in it, or if I did, I kept it to myself. I was living by then in a rental apartment downtown that I actually liked. High ceilings, good light, close enough to walk to my old office, which I still visited regularly because Kevin had kept me on as a part-time consultant while he found his footing. One evening in March, I was at a small dinner party at a colleague's house, and I met a woman named Renee, who worked in commercial real estate and had recently relocated from Chicago. She was smart and direct, and laughed at things I said, without seeming to try. We talked for most of the evening without particularly meaning to. I drove home afterward and sat in my apartment for a while, and realized I felt something I hadn't felt in quite a long time. I texted her the next day. She replied within an hour. I'm not going to make this into a larger story than it is. Some things take time to understand. Looking back now, the part that strikes me most about that year isn't the paperwork or the discovery process, or even the photographs in Roy's manila folder. It's the morning at the kitchen table, the cup of coffee I had poured before she came downstairs, the quiet, the 19 years of ordinary mornings that had preceded it. I had spent a long time being someone who absorbed things and kept moving and called that stability. I had mistaken silence for steadiness. The betrayal was Sandra's doing, not mine, but the long drift that had made space for it. The way two people can live alongside each other and gradually become strangers without either of them quite deciding to. That was something we had both participated in without meaning to, and without noticing until it was already done. I don't tell people this part often. The justice part of the story is more satisfying, and I understand why. Marcus losing his job, Sandra's renovation stalled, the methodical patience that turned out to matter more than any confrontation would have, all of that has a clean shape to it. I understand the appeal. But the true thing, the thing I actually carry with me, is simpler than that. It's the decision I made on that first night, sitting in the dark kitchen with a glass of water while my wife showered upstairs. The decision to be still. To think before I spoke. To understand everything before I changed anything. 23 years of accounting will do that to you, I suppose. I saw Sandra once, about a year after everything was settled. We were both at the same pharmacy, and we nearly walked into each other at the prescription counter. It was awkward for about 2 seconds. She looked tired. I asked how she was. She said fine. I said I was glad. And then we each got our prescriptions and walked out through different doors. That was all there was to it. No grand speeches, no final accounting. Just two people who had shared a life and then stopped sharing it, passing each other in a pharmacy, being civil. I drove home, called Renee, and asked if she wanted to get dinner. She said she was already thinking about it. People who hear this story usually want to know if I feel like I won. It's a reasonable question, and I've thought about it more than I expected to. The honest answer is that winning isn't quite the right frame for any of it. What I know is this: the way a thing ends has almost everything to do with the way you carry yourself through the middle of it. Daniel didn't get his life back because he was lucky. He got it back because he refused to let his worst moment turn him into his worst self. That distinction matters more than most people give it credit for. There's a version of this story where I walked upstairs that Tuesday night, grabbed Sandra's phone, and started screaming. I've thought about that version. In that version, I'm sleeping in my car within a week. My firm's valuation is in chaos because I've been visibly falling apart, and Marcus Hale's attorneys are painting me as the unstable one in every filing. Everything I had built over 23 years becomes collateral damage in a single night of uncontrolled emotion. The outcome I actually got, the settlement, the structure buyout, the clean exit, none of that exists in that version. I threw it all away the moment I chose heat over patience. Moral clarity is only useful when it's paired with the discipline to act on it carefully. Knowing you've been wronged doesn't automatically give you the right tools to respond. That comes from something slower. It comes from choosing, over and over, to think before you move. I also want to say something about what happened to Marcus because I think it matters. I didn't destroy him. He destroyed himself over years through choices that had nothing to do with me. The financial troubles that unraveled his position at the hospital existed long before he ever met Sandra. I simply made sure that my own house was in order so that when his house fell, it fell on him and not on me. That's not revenge in the dramatic sense. It's just the natural consequence of how people actually live. Eventually, the gap between what someone presents and what they actually are becomes impossible to maintain. I didn't need to push. I only needed to get out of the way. What I learned from all of it? The part that has stayed with me in a way that the logistics and the paperwork and the attorney fees have not, is that your character is not what you feel in your hardest moment. It's what you choose to do with what you feel. I felt grief and rage and humiliation and loss. All of it real, all of it justified. And I chose, every single morning for 11 weeks, to set it aside long enough to think clearly. That's not suppression. That's not coldness. That's the kind of strength that doesn't look like anything from the outside, but turns out to be the only thing that actually protects you. The world has a way of returning to people roughly what they put into it over time. Not immediately, not dramatically, not with any particular sense of theater. Just quietly, steadily, the way compound interest works, the way a reputation is built, the way trust accumulates and erodes. Daniel is eating breakfast with Renee now. Sandra is living with a half-finished renovation and a man who is working very hard to keep a story straight. That's not fate. That's not punishment handed down from anywhere. It's just the sum of the choices each of them made, one Tuesday at a time. Be patient, be honest, and when you're sitting in the dark at the kitchen table, trying to decide what kind of person you're going to be in the worst year of your life, choose the version of yourself you'll still respect when the year is over.